I kind of grew up as a fan of glam rock music when I was a little kid, and those artists always seemed like they were from another planet, and the clothes that they wore seemed very unattainable. Later, I found out that they were made by their friends, family, girlfriends, husbands, so on, but they seemed very unattainable. But when punk happened, and it's kind of similar to, other cultural movements that have sort of taken culture and taken it to very much a sort of street access. That's happened throughout the history of popular culture. And punk sort of took creation and made it accessible to everyone. So if you're a writer, you could, make a fanzine and photocopy it and sell it at punk shows for, 10 cents or whatever, and communicate your ideas to the world, which today you can do on social media much easier. With punk, you could take your flared trousers and cut the flare off the side and duct tape it together. You didn't have to learn how to sew. Similarly, you could pick up a guitar, as I did, and play completely out of tune, as I did and still do, and sing completely out of tune, as I did and still do. And you could make a noise, and your friends, peers would come to a show and see you, because everybody was sort of part of the whole. The people on stage and the people in the audience were the same people.
Keanan Duffty is a British fashion designer and musician based in New York City. Duffty studied fashion design at St. Martin's School of Art in London and is a member of the Council of Fashion Designers of America. He is also a mentor for the master's program in fashion styling at Polimoda and a program director at the Masters of Professional Studies in Fashion Management at Parsons School of Design. Whew, that's a lot. In addition to launching his own label, Slinky Vagabond, in the 1990s, Keanan would later work for brands like Gwen Stefani's L.A.M.B, John Varvatos, and launched the Walmart line for David Bowie. Duffty also co-authored the book Rebel, Rebel, Antistyle, which traced the roots of rebel style and emphasized the cultural impact of punk and the new romantic era. I had the opportunity to sit down with Keanan to talk about his journey as a designer, his life in the music industry, along with some of his favorite fashion moments of all time. Check it out. Hello, Keanan. I'm just so thrilled to have the opportunity to chat with you. I mean, what a life. What a life.
I'm thrilled to chat with you, and I'm thrilled to be. I need to add a fashion moment mug to my mug collection.
I will send you one, Keanan.
No, I'm going to buy one. I'll buy one from this.
So how's everything going? Teaching during a pandemic? How are the students doing? I mean, this is a crazy time.
It's a crazy time. Yeah, it's been a interesting 16, 17 months.
Yeah.
The course that I was the founder of, we actually were in the process of launching an online component to that course, which was created in the most part by my colleague Joshua Williams, who's kind of really an expert in the sort of online delivery of education.
Wow.
And so we were actually able to sort of move to that in the middle of, sort of May of last year.
Wow.
Quite somewhat seamlessly, because we had a lot of the content already prepared, and that's all credit to Joshua. And he also launched a podcast too for our students. So
I love it.
Yeah. So there were a lot of different kind of, elements of communication going on. And our students graduated last August, the first year.
Wow.
We had 32 students in the first year of the program. We're just about to accept about 160 this year. So it's grown tremendously. So it's
wow.
It's a growth spurt. So something's working.
Yeah. I think it's also just being stuck inside for so long, just really thinking about, what do I love doing? What's my passion? And really taking an opportunity to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think also, with the course that I'm not director of the course anymore. Professor Joshua Williams took over as director this year. But the course is called Masters in fashion management, Masters of Professional
Love it.
Studies in
Yes.
Fashion Management. So it's really about anchoring the kind of business and entrepreneurial side of the industry to the aesthetic side.
Yeah.
So we're kind of empowering future leaders, future entrepreneurs, and looking at the pillars of what the New School stands for, which it's kind of always stood for historically from when it was founded, which is being, diverse, inclusive, equitable, sustainable, sort of aware of social justice and an activist in terms of social justice. And we're trying to find ways of activating those ideas much more in fashion from the fashion business aspect. And students are really on board because, your generation are thinking they've grown up thinking about climate change. They've grown up thinking about sustainability. They've grown up thinking about diversity and inclusivity. So we're speaking to an audience that are like a sponge, so
I love it.
So hopefully they're going to be the future leaders.
I'm like, Keanan, you think I'm a Gen Zer? Because I am a millennial. I'm actually an elder millennial. So I'll take it. So let's delve into your life, Keanan. I mean, wow, you guys. I mean, Keanan is just, he's in fashion, music. I mean, just a culture, like a cultural shapeshifter, just amazing. So let's start from the beginning. Where are you from and where did you grow up?
So I'm from a small town in the north of England that was primarily a coal mining community. So,
wow.
Like I was talking to my mum and dad a few weeks ago. They left school when they were 14, both of them. I mean, that was like, you left school at 14, you went to work down a coal mine, or my mum worked in the factory that made the explosives for the coal mine.
Amazing.
So they both thought, we don't want to do this for the rest of our lives. So my mum trained to be a hairdresser. My dad was, in the UK up until the 50s, you had to go into the army for a couple of years when you're 18 to 20 years old. So my dad came out of the army, and both my mum and dad are very entrepreneurial. So they started small businesses, first of all, in the sort of hair industry, hence
I love it.
My love of hair dyeing. I kind of grew up in that world. So that's where I learned to have an entrepreneurial spirit and to kind of figure out how to get things done. And I'm quite restless. So, I, as you said, I sort of have done a lot of things but primarily I've made a living doing fashion. I mean, that's what I've really, music is a love of mine, but primarily I've made my living in fashion and in design and producing clothes and so on.
But I mean, ultimately, I feel like it's all art. It's all expression, so it's like all different parts of you.
It is. And it comes, I think, with any, I try to sort of relate this idea to students that, if your creative expression and what you do in the world, if it comes from your heart, then I think other people receive that. They recognize that it's being done for quite pure reasons.
Yeah.
And not everything has to be big scale. You can be a designer who, if you identify there are 10 other people in the world that are your customers, and you make clothes and those 10 people buy those clothes every season or every delivery, or they wear them every time you design something, then that's 100% success. So
wow.
If you're H&M and you're making millions of garments and only a few hundred thousand of people are wearing them, and a lot of the rest of it is going into landfill, then it's a huge failure.
Yes.
So, and I'm not being down on H&M, by the way.
No, absolutely not. Absolutely not. We actually just had two representatives from Fashion Revolution on the show to talk about, some of the impacts that fashion production can have, but not necessarily pointing any direct fingers, but just figuring out ways as consumers that we can change our behaviors to help the planet. So it makes total sense. So, it's the 1970s, late 1970s. Okay. Punk band explosion. What inspired you to start Sordid Details?
Wow, you've done a bit of research.
I love it. I'm like, I was just like, oh my God, I could just imagine a little Keanan like picking up a guitar or mic and just, how did that happen? What was the process?
It was kind of, so I kind of grew up as a fan of of glam rock music when I was a little kid. And those artists always seemed like they were from another planet. And the clothes that they wore seemed very unattainable. Later, I found out that they were made by their friends, family, girlfriends, husbands, so on. But they seem very unattainable. But when punk happened, and it's kind of similar to, other cultural movements that have sort of taken culture and taken it to very much a sort of street access. That's happened throughout the history of popular culture. And punk sort of took creation and made it accessible to everyone. So if you're a writer, you could make a fanzine and photocopy it and sell it at punk shows for 10 cents or whatever, and communicate your ideas to the world, which today you can do on social media much easier with a bigger audience. With punk, you could take your flared trousers and cut the flare off the side and duct tape it together into you didn't have to learn how to sew. Similarly, you could pick up a guitar, as I did, and play completely out of tune, as I did and still do, and sing completely out of tune, as I did and still do. And you could make a noise, and your, friends, peers would come to a show and see you because everybody was sort of part of the whole. There wasn't really the people on stage and the people in the audience were the same people.
I love it.
And I think, it's happened, many times throughout popular culture. And today the great leveler is obviously, the social media exchange where we exchange our ideas, thoughts, and, sometimes there are ideas, thoughts that maybe you don't want to hear or don't want to.
Very true.
Staying in the creative realm, it gives a platform for everybody to have a voice, and like you with this amazing show, you have great guests. I mean, Simon Doonan's Simon.
So fun. So fun.
And a fellow Brit, and Lauren.
Yes, I love Lauren.
Icons like Byron Lars, for example. You have a lot of great guests, and you can reach an amazing audience. And that's the great thing about the this digital revolution. There's a lot of negative stuff, but the good stuff is this.
Absolutely.
So that's what punk was. It was a leveler, and it was actually. Where I grew up, there were sort of two worlds, let's say. There was a big scene in the north of England called Northern Soul, which was...
Oh, what?
So, yeah. So you should, if you get a chance, go and look online.
I will.
So Northern Soul kids were obsessive about finding very obscure releases on local labels from around the US. So basically, in the 60s, there were a lot of local labels that tried to emulate Motown. And one of the big examples I would give you is the song "Tainted Love," which was covered by Soft Cell, but that was originally a Northern Soul record. And that music had a big swing in it. It was almost like Martha and the Vandellas, the swing of the record and the tambourines high in the mix.
Yeah,
very strong vocal melody. And so all of these kids that were, my peers, half of my school was into Northern Soul, and they would turn up in an Adidas t-shirt, the most incredibly wide flared pants.
Wow.
Which when they were dancing, they would spin around and the flares would flare out like a Sufi whirling, Sufi master. And it was a big scene, it was a very big scene. And then the other side of the school were punk rock kids, but we were all the same. I mean, we were all, we all grew up in the same community, and we were all kind of mates. But there was almost like a line drawn in the playground of like the soul kids from one side, and of course, a lot of the soul kids had been Bowie fans, and a lot of the sort of punk kids had also been Bowie fans. So we kind of all had that shared sort of glam rock experience.
That is wild. So did you pick up the guitar? Like, did you teach yourself guitar, or did you write songs?
Yeah, so I started because my mum and dad thought I should learn an instrument. And initially they said, okay, there's a fellow in our village who teaches piano. You should go and learn piano from him. And he was, I'm going to be a bit ageist here. He was like an old fuddy-duddy guy, and he wanted me to learn to play classical piano, and I just couldn't get into it. So they then said, well, what about guitar? So they got me a classical guitar with nylon strings, and found a guitar teacher, and I started learning how to play classical guitar. But then a friend of mine said, well, all you're into punk, all punk music is based around what's called a bar chord, which you put your index finger across the neck, and then the other fingers form the chord. And you can play the same chord anywhere on the neck, and it creates different chords. And I was like, whoa, I'm off to the races. I only need to learn one thing. Let's put my hand in position. And I can play every punk record. So I painted the classical guitar black with like black paint.
So awesome.
And, put a piece of string around it. And then, I was sort of in business. And then I used to have a bicycle, which in the States we call banana seat bike, with the high handlebars.
Oh, yeah.
Like a chopper kind of thing.
That's hilarious.
And a friend of mine was very covetous of this bike. And he had an electric guitar and an amplifier. So I said to him, okay, I'll swap the guitar for the bike. So we swapped. And then I was kind of in business. And then I, got my friends around and we started rehearsing in the garage and writing songs and, playing terrible cover versions and annoying the neighbors.
I love it. I love it so much. How in the world did you end up at Central St. Martin's? Like, were you just like, hey, I think I want to do fashion. Like, what was the transition like for you?
Yeah, it wasn't. So I just loved the way musicians dressed. So it didn't matter. Like all musicians seem to come from somewhere else.
Wow.
Right. So whether it was, I don't know, the musicians of the 60s that had that kind of very psychedelic look.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you've seen, there's a great documentary on TV now called The Summer of Soul.
Oh my goodness. Oh.
So, I mean, so we didn't in the UK, we didn't have access to those kinds of events, Woodstock, so on. They weren't really, we had festivals in the UK, they were much smaller. But it's amazing seeing a documentary like that today where, everyone is dressed in this very kind of psychedelic, sort of, so whether it's Fifth Dimension or Stevie Wonder, all of the performers actually look, they really have a distinct look from that era. And then you look at Woodstock and it's the same thing, that everybody's kind of dressed the same. So fashion was kind of it didn't matter what kind of music you were into or what kind of music you performed, but the sort of stylistic sense was very unifying across culture and across the world. It's kind of interesting. So when I was a kid, I was always really longing to wear the clothes that musicians wore. But obviously, you didn't have access to that as a kid, and you sort of didn't have permission from the world to make stuff. It was kind of, permission was almost denied because you had to learn, had to become an expert in how to do it. But I would look at magazines, and I would always see in magazines, parties that were happening in London. And the best dressed people, it always said studying fashion at St. Martin's. And I thought, okay, I'm going to go there because that sounds like they look like they're having a great time.
Awesome.
That's the place. So that was really my impetus. It wasn't to study fashion per se. It was just to really be in that place. And, in the 80s, education was free. In England, it was free.
What?
Yeah. It could be free everywhere today. If you could win a place, you could go. So I kind of made a portfolio and went to London and bought the Vogue on the train.
Oh, wow.
Before I got on the train, I bought Vogue and I went through it and I looked at every designer's name. And then in the interview, repeated all the designers' names completely. Versace and Issey Miyake, I think it was like.
I love it. I cannot.
But they let me in. So, I must have, I must have done something right. So, that was really the impetus, was to go to that place. I didn't apply to any other colleges. It was either I go to St. Martin's or I'm not going to go anywhere, And,
I love it.
So I think, you're very, as a kid, you're willful and, you have arrogance and ego and so on. But it serves you in a good way some of the time. You believe in yourself, you have that innate self-belief.
I love that so much. And we're going to get to the arrogance in a second, because while you were at Central St. Martin's, there was a textile instructor who introduced you to someone.
Yeah.
Yes, Ashley. And then you kind of like get back into your music scene.
Yeah. So, well, I after punk, there was an era in the UK called New Romantics, which were what some people look at as a part of a definition of the early 80s. I mean, there's so many different things going on at the same time.
So much.
But today we kind of look back in a lens, and there's a certain electronic music and, the sort of flock of seagulls hairstyle. And, that's it's silly stuff that's easy to kind of pigeonhole that's what was happening. But it was much broader than that. But, I had this like little electronic music group, and we were going to clubs around the UK. And actually, I spoke of Soft Cell earlier. We used to go to a club in in Leeds called the Warehouse, where Mark Allman from Soft Cell was a DJ before they had their hits,
Wow.
So that was a kind of an embryonic stage. And that's what led me to go to St. Martin's. And so St. Martin's was really sort of an extension of that. And my teacher, Natalie Gibson, who still teaches at St. Martin's to this day, and is an amazing person. She's a real connector, so she would bring fantastic people into the college and introduce them to us, people like Paul Smith, the designer. And, we kind of have this access to her amazing network. And one day this woman came into the studio, and I was sort of screen printing with my squeegee and my inks and things. And Natalie said, "Oh, this person is a writer, and she's doing a book about T-shirts, and will you talk to her about screen printing?" So we got into conversation, and the woman, her name's Alice, and she said to me, "My husband is a manager." And I said, "Oh, really? Who does he manage?" And she said, Adam and the Ants, Adam Ant, who was at that time was a massively famous,
Major.
He also managed a band called X-Ray Specs, who were one of the sort of proponents of the early punk scene. And their singer was this girl who went by the name Polystyrene. But
my producer John is gonna go crazy. He's like obsessed. He's gonna die.
Yeah. So Polly was amazing because she was mixed race. She was a woman fronting a really amazing punk band. They made one very iconic album. And this guy, Falcon Stewart, managed her, managed Adam, managed many other really great acts. So he said, or rather Alice said, "Come over to dinner and meet my husband, and bring your demo, and we can have a listen and all of that." So I went over for dinner, and at the dinner there was a guy there who was a video producer. And at the end of the dinner, we'd sort of had this polite conversation. Meanwhile, I had to explain I had full makeup.
Yeah, I'm like, what are you wearing at this dinner?
Orange hair, like platform, high heel sneakers, the whole thing. And so at the end of the dinner, they said, "Oh, this is Steve, and he's going to show us the new video that he's made." And he put it on, and it was Dire Straits' "Money for Nothing." And it was the first video that was ever made like digitally.
Wow.
And they turned the Dire Straits guys into sort of digital animations. And so and this is one of the most groundbreaking music videos I've ever made, right?
Oh.
So it finishes, and talking about arrogance, it finishes, and they all turn to me because I'm like the kid. And what do you think? And my response was, "Well, I'm glad you can't see Mark Knopfler because he's really ugly."
Stop it right now. Oh my goodness. I love it though. I love it.
The universe soon put me in my place because obviously that was one of the biggest hits of the 80s and one of the most iconic music videos. So.
But still, I think it's good to sort of have, a very strong sense of self and an opinion, regardless of who it is.
Yeah. I mean, essentially, like I tell fashion students that, we're paid really to have an opinion because you may design something in a particular color with a particular style, a particular pattern. Who says that's right? It's you that says that's what the world should be wearing. And you have to have that courage of conviction to be able to do that. It's very important.
So. Absolutely. Speaking of arrogance, though. Oh, hey, Keanan, would you like to meet Freddie Mercury? No, I'm good. Did you regret that moment? Did you meet him later?
No,
of course. Back drinks a few years down the road?
Of course, in retrospect, what a miss, But I mean, that was fun because this guy, the Falcon, the manager, got me into EMI Records.
Wow.
They had a studio in the basement of their building, which was a very famous building. It's on the cover of two Beatles albums, the red and blue albums, where the Beatles are kind of peering over the cover. And they got me a producer who was the guy who was the engineer on Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon, right?
What?
So they got messing around. They got really good people. My demos were rubbish, but we had all the right ingredients. And during the recording, of course, they said, Freddie's in the next studio making demos for his solo record. Do you want to come and say hello? And I was like, nah, it's okay.
I'm good.
I'm good. Let's just get this right.
That is wild. Well, you finish at Central St. Martin's and you eventually move to New York in 1993. You establish your Soho studio, and then you decide, hey, you know what? I'm going to start my own line around 1998. So what was life like in New York for you? Like moving from England to the city, especially at that time. And then also starting your own line, your own fashion line. What were some of the, challenges and interesting experiences at that time for you?
It was, it's a really good question. London and New York have similarities. And today they're more similar, much more similar than they were 30 years ago now. We're coming up to 30 years. But my attraction to New York was the sort of 24-hour, and actually to America was the sort of can-do spirit, where someone has an idea and they go forward with that idea and they turn it into a reality. I always used to say, when I graduated from college, I had my own little collection in London, and I would ask a manufacturer a question or a retailer a question, and the answer was always no. No, and then it became a negotiation to get to maybe.
Yeah.
In the US, the difference for me was that the answer always appeared to be yes, and then we'll figure it out. Let's do it, and then we'll figure out how to do it. It wasn't coming from, and it was very British. I mean, it's probably not so much anymore, but it was a very British attitude to sort of be, no, that's more than my job's worth, mate. I can't do that. So that was my attraction to America, and certainly to New York, and to the 24-hour life. I came to New York and didn't sleep for a year. It was
my goodness. Yes.
It's just fantastic. And I came to New York illegally. I mean, I came here as a tourist and just stayed. Don't try that at home, folks.
I love it.
It was a sort of land of opportunity. To me, at least, it felt like that. And I had to get legal here, so I had to get a job and get a visa and all the rest of it. So that was sort of my first priority when I got here. That and going out to nightclubs and bars.
I mean, that's how you meet people.
That's
how you meet people. There
was no internet, so networking is you have to get out there and talk to people.
Yeah.
So that was sort of my kind of introduction to New York, and then. Part of getting legal actually was I incorporated a company, and then that company sponsored me to be here. Again, don't try that.
Brilliant! Oh my goodness, Keanan.
So that's what the fashion label grew out of. It kind of came out of that necessity to work for myself. Because I have worked for other companies, obviously, but I really enjoy working for myself and sort of directing myself. That was really the reason for starting the company.
So what was it called?
I think the IRS or the immigration stuff wanted to get me now.
I know. He's legal now. Nothing you can do. Okay.
Can't touch me. My taxes are paid, and I have a green card. So there you go.
I love it. So what was the fashion line called?
So originally, I incorporated in order, I thought I have to have a company name that can't be my name because you can't sponsor yourself. So I called the company Slinky Vagabond, which is a lyric from a Bowie song. Bowie sort of did an album called Young Americans, which he recorded in Philadelphia, which is very pivotal album for him. And, working with amazingly Luther Vandross and Ava Cherry, who were singing backup, for Bowie. I mean, this is before they were both known on their own terms. But the one of the lyrics in the song Young Americans is Slinky Vagabond, and I just like the way it sounded, and I'm a huge Bowie fan, so I kind of purloined that and used that as my incorporated name, and then that's what the brand was initially called.
It's amazing.
Vagabond. And yeah.
I have to ask you, since we're mentioning him, how in the world did you meet David and eventually get to work with him and collaborate?
David had a stylist, photographer who worked with him called Jimmy King, who's an amazing guy, lovely guy, very, very talented. And Jimmy, I had a showroom that I worked with that was on Broadway, just off Soho. And Jimmy used to go to that showroom to pull pieces from various designers for David and the band to wear for, various events. And one of the events, he did a show at Roseland in New York.
Oh, wow.
And Iman was heavily pregnant at the time. It was literally just before their daughter was born. So David had done the show, and then he was doing a sort of meet and greet or press thing afterwards. And so he wore a shirt that I made, which was a sort of burgundy colored shirt with a what they call the George Cross, which is the British part of the British flag, part of the British Union flag. And so that was kind of the first time that I saw him wearing something like mine, but I didn't meet him at that point. And then a few years later, I was doing a lot of sort of rock and roll clothes, like clothes for other musicians, people like Sex Pistols and all sorts of people. And I approached his management company, and I was interested in doing clothes not for him, but merchandise for the tours. And unbeknownst to me, David, that was when he was starting to have health issues, and he stepped back from touring. And so the management company said, we love the idea, but it's not the right time. They didn't tell me why. And then a few years later, I'd launched my line at Target. And so at that point, I thought, right, I'm going to go back and talk to the David's business management organization and see if there's an interest with doing a sort of Bowie collection for Target, because it was very broad. It was in a lot of stores. And from a business standpoint, it would make sense,
Yeah.
It would make sense for David. And so that's how we initially met. We met on 57th Street at the management company offices. And that was in the fall of 2006. Yeah, 2006.
Wow.
And it was very, it's very interesting meeting. I mean, I kind of my creative juices were totally inspired initially by David Bowie, and then obviously by the punk movement, because they, as creative people, they seem so free.
Yeah.
Especially Bowie, he could kind of change. Every record was a different record. Every look was a different look. He didn't seem to be encumbered by a commercial direction, like, oh, I've had a hit with this, I'm just going to keep doing this.
Yeah.
He kept changing and evolving, and he was restless in that way. And I think, that's something that had a big influence on me, was to sort of not stand in one spot, but just to kind of keep moving forward. So it was a great opportunity to work with him. And we worked together over the course of 2007, up until the launch of the collection, which was launched in October for Holiday. And we had his offices, which were downtown. His offices were opposite where he lived. And he was kind of, very generous throughout the whole process. I mean, he was a very witty guy, and very down to earth. There was David Jones, which is actually Bowie's real name, and then there was the David Bowie character.
Wow!
And you realise that was actually a character, and then on top of that character, there were other characters. So it was kind of like an onion.
Wow!
Eventually, I met the person that was like the core of the onion, which was David Jones, and he would turn up to meetings dressed in, very not fashionable clothes.
Wild.
You'd kind of think like, oh wow, is he messing with me?
Is it you?
Yeah, it was just because he was he put on a mask and a costume when he was David Bowie, but when he wasn't David Bowie, he was David Jones, and it was the real guy,
That's awesome. That's awesome that you were able to experience that.
Yeah, and he's very open. He said to me, I don't want to be presented as the designer. I'm not the designer, you're the designer. I'm the inspiration for the collection. And that's absolutely what he was, So I love it. It was a good working relationship, I think. I hope so. I mean,
well, you were, when you launched your line, you, over the years, you really built up an amazing business. I mean, you're in Bergdorf's, you're in Bloomingdale's, all these major retailers, you're doing collabs with, Target. What essentially was the key to your success? Because I think it's very hard sometimes for designers to scale up.
Yes, it is. Yeah, it is. It was necessity, to be absolutely honest. It was necessity. I mean, and luck, a lot of luck. I'm grateful. I'm a very lucky person, that's, I mean, there's a famous musician, Brian Eno, who's a producer of U2 and Coldplay and others. And he always says that, I'm going to get the quote completely wrong, but luck is preparation meeting opportunity.
Yes, that's right.
I don't think that's his quote actually, but he always says that's true. So putting yourself in the right place at the right time, but also having the know-how to then make something happen, and having the skill to put that in place. And I think that's very important. And I collaborated with people like Reebok, for example. I collaborated with Reebok for 3 years, and that was partly out of necessity, partly out of luck of meeting them, and then partly out of necessity because they were funding my runway shows.
Yeah,
they were actually producing the sneakers in what for them would have been small quantities, like 500 pieces of a style, and you couldn't do that in the real world. You couldn't go out and get a small number of sneakers made. You have to get 5,000 pairs. So, my advice to young designers, emerging designers today is to be open to experimentation and collaboration. And at the time, Reebok were a very damaged brand. They weren't cool at all. I mean, today, Pierre Moss is collaborating. And Kirby's the creative director at Reebok. It's in a very aspirational brand, but in the early 2000s, it was way behind Nike. It was way behind Adidas. It was even way behind Puma. I mean, it really wasn't.
Agreed.
So when I collaborated with them, it kind of wasn't a cool brand, and a lot of designers might have said, "Oh, I don't want to go near that because it doesn't have the cool factor." But I always think, you can bring something to a brand like that. It's very hard to have an impact with Nike because they're kind of number one, or, Adidas and Nike are kind of number one. But with a brand that's damaged, that needs help, you can actually have an impact,
I love that. And did you teach yourself like the business, or did you learn that at Central St. Martin's and sort of apply it, like the business side of retail and, the markups and the sell-throughs and, all of that craziness?
I didn't learn. So, we did, there was a bit of sort of fashion business taught at St. Martin's, but, as a kind of arrogant young designer, you kind of don't want to know. You're sort of like, no, it's all about the design. That's all I'm interested in. So I kind of learned that side after I graduated. I was making stuff literally on my kitchen table and taking it to retail stores, and then going home and wondering why they hadn't sent me a check 6 months later because I hadn't given them an invoice. I didn't know to write an invoice. So I learned that through experience. And then when I launched my business, initially I was completely on my own, and then my wife Nancy Garcia got involved initially to help me, because she could see that I was drowning, and she's very, very experienced in business and has run several businesses of her own, handbag company, photography company, and so on. So she got really involved, and I learned a lot from her. I
love it. School of power couple.
Yeah, school of hard knocks and school of learning from your better half. So it's kind of again, finding a partner in fashion. Many of the really successful designers have had a sort of left brain, right brain relationship. Everyone from Giorgio Armani to Valentino, you look at their sort of the other side of their business, and there's always someone with business acumen really driving it forward.
So true.
I mean, Giorgio Armani is a great business person, but without his, sadly departed former partner, would it have been the business that it is today? So it's really great if you can find someone who you trust.
Yeah.
and not always working with, your partner or other half, because sometimes, it's difficult to work with someone that you're in a relationship with, because when you go home, there's sort of nothing else to talk about.
You have to turn it off. Yeah.
You have to turn it off. Yeah?
It's so hard.
It works sometimes and it doesn't, and sometimes it doesn't work, but I think it's very important to have that for
I love it.
Yeah. For an emerging designer, it's good to have someone to bounce those ideas off as well.
And all of these, you've worked with several brands like L.A.M.B, which I love. Did you work with Gwen?
Yes, yeah. I worked briefly with L.A.M. We went to. She had I don't think she has the same house now, but she had a house in the Hollywood Hills.
Yeah.
And we went to work with her there, literally around her kitchen table.
I love it.
With fabric swatches and sketches and so on.
It was such a great brand, and I can totally see how your influence.
Well, I think both Gwen and I have one of the same core influences, which is Vivienne Westwood. We're both Vivienne Westwood fanatics.
Yeah.
And, so I think it's very easy to have a working relationship with someone if their inspiration is your inspiration, So Vivienne, coming from obviously the punk movement, but then she evolved her business to being a sort of irreverent, kind of British icon, and I think that was kind of why there was a simpatico relationship with working with Gwen. I worked with her very briefly, and it was sort of sad that her brand really went away, because like all small brands, you develop a business, maybe you get into a department store like Bloomingdale's, but they don't really take a big risk on young talent, so they'll buy for maybe 6 or 8 stores in a few metropolitan locations.
Yeah.
But to get it to go beyond that is really hard. And that's why when I had the opportunity to work with Target, I saw a way to go mainstream, actually. And David Bowie said that to me. He said, you can be a cult artist, but at some point you've got to get into the mainstream. You can then go back to being a cult artist, because as long as you don't turn off your core audience, you will have touched popular culture. And that was kind of an interesting, and he did that with he did an album called Let's Dance in the early 80s that was massively successful. Nile Rodgers produced it. It was very much, a kind of an R&B infused record, and it was a big hit in America and around the world. And then consequently, he kind of went back to almost being like an underground artist, but Bowie, but an underground.
It's amazing. I love it. This is a great advice for life.
Yeah, so, for a designer, it's kind of it's key to know who you are, who your audience is, and also what your audience wants from you. And I think that I stumbled upon that a few times. I stumbled upon it with sneakers, because I worked with Reebok and then Gola, and then I did a collaboration with Dr. Martin as well. So the sort of footwear side of it, I'm not trained in footwear, but I recognize that the audience that I speak to, and they wanted footwear from me, and we had a very big business for the sneaker side of our company in Japan. It was like, blew up. And even today, I was in Beijing a couple of years ago, and this young sneaker freak came to an event that I was hosting. And he brought all of these highly collectible Instapump Furies that I did, which now you see them on eBay for a lot of money. And he had the full set, and he knew stuff about them even that I didn't know or had forgotten. So you can tap into a sort of seam of people that are fanatics about a certain thing, sometimes accidentally, as I did. And in that world, you become known for that, so.
I love it so much.
Not a bad thing.
So, I got to get into it. What inspired you to write your Rizzoli book, which I love? Rebel, Antistyle. Like, were you just like, hey, you know what? I want to just, give sort of like a history lesson on the amazing culture and music and all of these things that you've witnessed throughout your life. Like, what inspired you to do it?
Well, it was so. There's a great kind of cultural documentarian in the UK, a guy called Paul Gorman, who's written a number of books about sort of fashion and music related topics, graphic design and other topics too. And he had a book called The Look, which was subtitled Adventures in Pop Rock Fashion. Oh, wow. And that was published, I think, in 2000. And he was working on a second edition. And so he contacted me and he said, can I interview you for the second edition? And because he wanted to include some New York-based designers. And I said, yeah, sure. And we kind of hit it off. And so after that book was published, he said to me, look, I think, you should tell your story. Wow. And he said, if you're interested, I would love to collaborate with you on a book. And that essentially became Rebel Antistyle, became the book Rebel Antistyle. It wasn't called that originally. It had a totally name. The publisher wanted to call it that because they wanted to play on the Bowie Association. And, so again, the lesson in it was with like everything, you have to, you collaborate obviously with others, and the sort of flow of ideas goes in a certain way. And you kind of have to go with it. Because the outcome will be better, right? So the outcome, we had a publisher in the UK, and we had Rizzoli in the US, and Rizzoli's partner in the US for this publication was Urban Outfitters.
Oh, wow. Perfect.
They obviously, it went into Target, it went into a lot of other retailers too, but they said to me, with our research, we recognized that, that we would like the title to be Rebel. And so that became the title.
Like, okay.
And the idea with the book was to have 10 different items in fashion or in clothing that have been worn throughout the history of popular culture in the late 20th century, and that keep coming back, so,
yes.
You see, obviously Marlon Brando wore the black leather jacket in The Wild One. And then, today you might see Pharrell or, the singer from Duran Duran wearing a brightly colored, neon colored motorbike jacket. But it's the same message. It's saying the same thing to the world. It's saying, I'm a rebel outsider. But, if Pharrell's wearing it and it's neon pink, there's a slightly different expression today. He's not doing the same thing that Marlon Brando did 70 years ago or whatever.
Yeah.
He's speaking to today's audience, in a way that today's audience will relate to it. They still know he's sort of outside of the mainstream, even though he's a massively successful artist and very influential on culture, but he's sort of choosing to wear neon pink because it's not, a black jacket today would be kind of conformist. Neon pink is like, okay,
yes,
this is like, I'm claiming this for the culture today. So yeah, I think and that was the impetus behind the book. It was like, let's look at the t-shirt and how it's evolved throughout the history of fashion and music, and let's look at the prom dress, and let's look at the jean, and so on.
Wild. As I was looking through the book and just looking at some of your previous interviews, it just made me think about just how in fashion, all of these cycles, like we just keep recycling sort of the same decades over and over again. And there must have been something unique about the decades that we continue to repeat. And what can we do, or how can we be more rebellious or anti-fashion to maybe create a new decade that's completely different and sort of get out of this cycle? Is there something that you share with your students or a personal belief that could sort of help us move past this consistent repetition?
It's a very, very good question, and it's an existential question. So I think today, rather than purely being about style, it is about style, but I think it's about the bigger questions in society. And I touched on those at the beginning of our conversation. So, social justice, sustainability, climate change, these really big issues that if we don't tackle them, they are,
devastating.
They're devastating on society itself. So we're doing harm to ourselves by not addressing these issues. And I think that's the challenge for fashion today, is to truly get to grips. And we're seeing it in many different ways through, a young emergent accessory company in Brooklyn called Ashia, who are making really, the two young women that are the founders of that company are making sort of they're telling a story of travel. They're going to different regions in the world, and they're producing goods from those regions. They're doing it in a luxurious way. They're doing it in an equitable way because they're kind of sharing, the profit, so to speak, with the people that are manufacturing the goods, and they're sharing their story with the world. They're an example that I would give. Another is as a great accessory company also in Brooklyn called Bond Hardware that are going to.
Oh my goodness. I love that. I want that little hammer ring. I'm like obsessed.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think, they have a very singular vision. They are of the community that they're speaking to. So whether it's, you mentioned earlier millennial or Gen Z or whatever, I don't really think about it in terms of community. Is not about age, race, whatever. They are, but they're about your view of the world. So your like-mindedness, and I think that's in fashion. You tend to connect with that like-minded community, and it can be big or small. And I think those kinds of brands are the ones that today are making an impact because they aren't recycling ideas. They aren't taking ideas from other decades. They're actually doing something that is new. I think, Ashley and Moya from Asher would say, the influence of their cross-shoulder bag or the bum bag or whatever, you look back at contemporary culture. I mean, go back to late 70s, early 80s hip hop or whatever, and you see that kind of, that accessory, that's when it kind of came to cultural relevance, was sort of through that subcultural expression. But they're not recycling it. They're taking something and making something completely new and fresh. 2021 with it, very contemporary. So I think that it is happening. But it's like with music. I mean, you listen to look at any TV show today. We've been binge watching Never Have I Ever. I don't know if you've seen that show.
I have not yet. Adding it to my list.
It's great. I mean, it's Mindy Kaling is the executive producer, and I think she wrote quite a lot of it. It's a great series, and the characterization is fantastic. The storytelling's great, but the music, I keep hearing these relatively new artists throughout the show, and I get on, social media and look them up and listen to their music properly, and it's all very kind of 80s inspired, let's say. It's not 80s per se,
right?
But there's one band called Cannons who have a song. The title "Fire" is in the title. "Fire for You" is the title, and it's kind of like an 80s sort of gentle funk track, with a very dream pop vocal over it. I
love it.
So it definitely has an influence from that era, but it's of 2021. It's very definitely today. I think it's easy to reference other eras. And I think we've been through a big period of sort of sample culture, right? Not just from sampling music, but sampling in fashion.
Yeah.
So saying, I'm gonna take a little bit of that and a little bit of that and put it together, and you can do that and make a new thing that's the third thing. But you can also just steal and appropriate.
I know.
Fashion's done a lot of that. Sort of,
it's like we're going to take that body and take that color and make it happen.
but again, and I think today, we're in a very sensitive time in culture, and appropriation, is obviously something that fashion has to address.
Oh yeah.
But when I look at, for example, Vivienne Westwood, Vivienne and Malcolm McLaren did a collection in the early, 1983, I think it was, called Witches. They collaborated with Keith Haring, and they did.
Yes. Yes. Simon talked about that.
Yeah. So, and Malcolm came to New York, and he saw kids wearing white sneakers with the laces undone, and he was walking in the street, and he saw this guy coming towards him wearing a Sex Pistols t-shirt, and he stopped the guy and he said, "I used to manage that band." And the guy said, "This was a band?" and the guy was Afrika Bambaataa, right? One of the architects of hip hop. And he said to Malcolm, "Come up to the Bronx tonight." I know this because Malcolm's told this story many times when he was living. He told the story, but I interviewed him once and he told it to me again ad nauseum. But he went up to the Bronx and he saw for the first time kids with like 3 turntables plugged into a street light having a party in the street. And it was totally like, talk about playing a guitar out of tune, like not being able to play an instrument. This was like, get rid of the instruments. Let's just have the turntables. So there was beats on one, maybe a loop of a vocal on another, and maybe a hook from another record on another. And that's kind of, if you listen to Grandmaster Flash, Wheels of Steel, I mean, talk about the blueprint for contemporary music. I mean, that's right. It's all there on that record.
Wow.
So we have had a history of, which became sampling. It became, somebody created the Akai sampler, and then suddenly you could do all this perfectly, alter the tempo and time and everything. And we started doing that in fashion from the beginning of fashion. I mean, Yves Saint Laurent was doing collections that were influenced by different regions in the world because he would travel there and so on. And, he wouldn't necessarily give credit to a community that he was sort of taking these ideas from. But I think that was very much, I'm not excusing it, but that was very much a different time. And that was how fashion worked. And it's worked like that really up until the beginning of this decade. I think really people started to say, we should be actually not just going to the Ndebele tribe in Africa and taking their textiles, but we should actually acknowledging that and giving something back to that community if we're going to take from it, So I think that's why today fashion needs to start recycling in terms of the actual product, but stop recycling in terms of the ideas.
I love that. And you are a member of the CFDA. When did you join the CFDA, and what, how are you currently working in that organization?
So I joined in 2007. There's a famous quote from Groucho Marx that is, I wouldn't want to be wouldn't want to be a member of a club that would have me as a member.
I love it.
So there's a little bit of that. But I'm part of the CFDA Education Committee, which is how I know Ashley and Moya from Asher, and it's how I know the Bond Hardware team, because they've been part of a scholarship program that's part of the CFDA, which
you're doing great work, you guys. Great work.
Yeah, and that's kind of that's the thing I do really like about CFDA. My involvement in CFDA, that's what I really like. I think it's Sarah Kozlowski, who's the head of the CFDA Education Initiative, is doing really great work there. And she has been for the last 7 or 8 years, maybe longer, actually. But helping to educate emerging talent and helping emerging talent to get a foothold financially. I mean, it's not the awards are not that big, so they're not really going to make or break a business, but the mentorship that's offered along with the financial reward is really beneficial, because it's about mentorship, it's about network, it's about a community, it's about a support system, and I think that's the really good thing about CFDA. And it's an organization that has been a bit of a sort of velvet rope mentality, actually, to be very frank, for years. I mean, I was amazed to be admitted into it.
I know it's tough. It's tough, getting into the CFDA.
It's starting to, Diana Festival did great work there. She opened it up, and she actually said to young talent, "Come and join." Whereas before that, it was a little bit like, it was Ralph, it was Donna, it was Calvin, that elite, and now I think it's opening up to a greater degree.
Absolutely.
Really, really benefiting younger emerging talent too.
I'm so excited about it. Yeah. You have been very active in fashion education. Currently, you're like, I mean, you're the founding director of the Masters in Fashion Management program at Parsons, and you also founded the Master in Fashion Business program for New York University, and along with several other projects. What is the significance of fashion education, and is it something that either fashion professionals or designers should pursue or consider when sort of, figuring out their careers? I know that my parents were just, I wanted to go to fashion school, and they were like, "Are you nuts? Like, business only, which I'm glad, they did. And I wound up studying international business with a concentration in marketing. And I was like, okay, that's great. Now I'm ready to go work in fashion. But they didn't really understand the value of a fashion education. Like what would you say to folks like that?
Well, I think that a career in fashion was most traditionally thought of as a design career, although, there's fashion marketing, there's fashion communications and writing and so on. But I think primarily it was the sort of go-to for someone who wanted to pursue a creative in quotes. Without realizing that business is also very creative. And,
Thank you.
Creativity is in all aspects of life, so it's not just limited to design. But I think from my own experience, having studied at St. Martin's and come out of it, like every other kid in my year, thinking you're going to be the next great fashion designer, because that's the training at St. Martin's, and it should be. That's what they do, But I think there's only room for a few of those people in the world, unfortunately. In the US, there are 23,000 graduates of design programs, fashion design programs, coming out of school every year. So there are 23,000 jobs every year. So the reality is it's a very challenging career to break into. And from my own perspective, I always thought that designers really did need to understand. They need the left brain, right brain aspect. They need to understand the way business works, even if they're not going to be the product development manager in their company, if they're not going to be the marketing executive in their company. Initially, if they're starting their own business, they're going to be all of those things, because they won't be able to afford to hire anybody else, right? So, they should know something about that. Otherwise, they're going to have to learn by making mistakes, and mistakes are expensive.
Yes.
You're spending your own money. It's, every mistake you make is your own loss. So I think it's very important to have that. And I'm a designer, I'm not a business person per se. So I wanted to create a course that had a very strong touch on the aesthetic side of fashion, but that also was very motivated in changing the way the business of fashion works. So to create the next wave of entrepreneurs that are maybe more conscious in the way that they're designing, creating, manufacturing and so on. And also the next wave of leaders and C-suite that are also looking at how can we, change the industry. And my friend Claudia Cividino, who's the CEO of Loro Piana here in North America, she was sort of part of that initial panel discussion that we had at Parsons when we were launching the program. And, we were looking at CEOs, for example, in all of the major fashion companies. Mostly they're men, mostly they're white men, and mostly the board is white men. Right. So actually, when you make a really stupid marketing error that, Gucci have done a couple of times in recent years, and that may have been a genuine, just dumb mistake, but it wouldn't have been a mistake if you had people in the room that said, wait a minute, do you realize that looks like, So that's why I think the course at Parsons is very important, because it's important to empower those future leaders. And I have to say, primarily the course is women. It's mostly women that are signing the course. So there's obviously an appetite for, female business leaders to really be change agents.
I love that.
And to be those, future and hopefully not so far in the future leaders in the industry, and to really be the voice of change, So I think it's necessary and needed, and it's grown tremendously. The course, since launching, the program's grown tremendously in terms of the volume of students that are coming in.
Wow!
So there's an appetite for it in the world, and hopefully we can be a springboard for that, and be the sort of the catalyst, for change.
I love that. I love that.
Parsons has a strong brand. So when you have Parsons on your resume, people are going to listen. So a company's going to listen. If they're looking to hire someone, they're going to listen. So hopefully we're doing something good with the program, and hopefully it continues to grow in the appropriate way. So it grows to match the opportunities that are out there in the industry.
Absolutely. You mentioned expensive mistakes. I just have to ask, what was your most expensive mistake as a fashion designer?
I've made too numerous to mention. What I will do, I will go back to the 101 mistake, right? The first mistake, which could have been calamitous, was that I called my company Slinky Vagabond. I thought that's such a wacky name. No one else is going to have that.
No one.
And I didn't trademark it. I didn't actually start to trademark the trademark process. So I'd been in business for a couple of years. I was selling to Barney's. Actually, I wasn't in Barney's at that stage. I was on the cusp of selling to Barney's, but I was in really great retailers in the US, in Japan, and in Europe.
Wow.
And I got a cease and desist letter from a footwear company in Sweden called Vagabond. And they said, you're infringing on our trademark and you must stop. And so I said, well, you guys make shoes. And this was before Reebok, so I wasn't making shoes.
Yeah.
I said, you guys make shoes, I make clothes. I don't see where the infringement is. And they said, no, we make clothes too. And they sent me a picture of a guy, obviously at a trade show, with a T-shirt that said Vagabond. And so they were protecting their IP because in the future they may want to make clothes, right? So I got a lawyer in Europe because I had to, fight the case in Europe. And it went on for probably about a year. And after a year, very expensive lawyers' fees, I thought, you know what, I'm just going to change the brand into my name because no one else literally. This was kind of before Keanan Thompson was famous. So I'd say to people, my name's Keanan, and they say, what, Tina? I say, no, Keanan. Okay. It's easy now because Keanan Thompson's so famous, everybody knows the name. And there are a few sports people called Keanan as well.
Yeah.
I don't know anything about sports, so excuse my dumbness.
No worries. Same here.
But that could have been a really expensive mistake because what I had to do is to go to all my stores and say, look, we're changing the name of the brand. You've already been selling it for 2 years and you've got some customer loyalty and we're going to change the name of the brand. But they were loyal to us. And actually Barney's then said, well, now we're interested in selling your line because they previously didn't want what they call brand names. They wanted designer names, which now it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter today, but then they wanted brand names, and my collection was made in Europe.
I love it. I love it.
Stupid snobbery that used to exist completely, thankfully, now has gone away to a degree. So yeah, that would have. So my, kids, if you're at home listening, if you decide on a name for your brand, trademark it
immediately. Now, this is a bit of a broad question, but you're so interesting. I'm like, what inspires your creativity? Like, where do you get your creative inspiration from? I know you just mentioned you were watching the Netflix series and you were like, oh, I hear something, and sort of piqued your interests. And, where do you get yours from?
It comes from sort of listening to my inner voice to a degree. And my wife always reminds me of this story. She says, one time when I was starting out, I was about to start designing a new collection. And I said to her, I don't have, I kind of can't find the inspiration. And she said to me, well, go up on the roof and just kind of meditate for a while and think about it. And I did. I went up on the roof and then I came down and I said, sword fencing.
Wow.
We go to a sword fencing school, which there was one in, Midtown Manhattan. Look at the clothes, look at the way, because they fasten up in a certain way.
Yeah.
They have, protective panels in certain places. And so, and the sort of gauze net mask that they wear is very interesting. The way the pose that they make.
So cool.
and so that became an influence for a collection. And it was from listening to your inner voice, you can get inspiration from many sources. Obviously, I do find traveling to be a very big inspiration because my mind is free to travel also when I'm in a different space. It may not be from going to a location and seeing something in that location that I verbatim think, okay, I'm going to do something that's that color or that's that concept. It's just from having the freedom in one's mind. And I do that, I often have my best ideas. I go out walking a lot. I often go out and have a walk, and I find changing the environment stimulates something inside to sort of think a little bit differently. And that's, I think, from a general perspective, I think most people can benefit from that by allowing that inner voice to be free and to sort of tell you what it's thinking.
Keanan, I love it because you have mentioned freedom so much during this conversation. And that's something I personally love as well, and something that I'm always striving for, not only physically, but mentally, just being mentally free. Yeah. How do you maintain your unique rebellious spirit? There's always, we're being bombarded with messages constantly, like on TV, social media, even in the industry, like whether it's at, Parsons or, fashion, CFDA, whatever, we're constantly being bombarded by messages of who we should be or how we should, conduct ourselves or the way we should think. How do you maintain your balance and and tapping into that voice that you mentioned, like always sort of residing there and not allowing things to?
It's a very, very good question. It's a very good question. I think so. I honestly feel like an outsider. And I think a lot of people feel that way in the world. I think it's a shared feeling from, much of society. We actually don't necessarily feel that we kind of belong, let's say. And it probably comes from, like, I grew up in a town where my accent today is totally different from my accent when I was a little kid. I moved to London and I was sort of teased a lot from having a kind of provincial accent. And I moved to London I was 18, so my accent kind of shifted into a London accent. But my mum and dad have a very strong Yorkshire accent. I mean, I always spoke clearly, but I definitely had, a sort of provincial twang to the way I spoke. And, in London, it was kind of the big city and everybody spoke in a very, sort of southern clipped way. So I definitely felt like an outsider there. But I also felt like an outsider when I was a little kid growing up, in school. I kind of didn't. And again, I think a lot of people feel like this. You may have a big group of friends and you may be, maybe a popular person, let's say, but you have that sort of feeling that you maybe either don't belong or shouldn't belong, And I think that is that outsiderdom has always played a big part in my makeup as a human, and I actually don't see it as a bad thing. I used to feel like it used to bother me a little bit, because it's always like the velvet rope's there and the other side, all the people have a good time. I'm standing here waiting. I'm never quite be there in, And you have to be honest. I still feel like that. I go to CFDA meetings and Tom Ford speaking as a new. Of course. I kind of feel like I don't really I'm not really part of this, and I'm sure 95% of the other people that are sitting there are the same thing. But I embrace that actually, and that's where my kind of, I'm not really rebellious. I mean, we've spoken for a little time now, and you probably can tell I'm probably not as I seem if you don't know me. Yeah. I just went and got my hair dyed yesterday.
It's awesome. He always has great hair, people.
I'm too old for hair dye, but I'm going to keep going. But it's, just part of that, that I think you have to have something to be against, actually. To be a creative person, you have to stand for something. You have to be against certain things. You have to go counter to what's happening. The way to stand out as a designer is do the opposite of what everybody else is doing. If everybody's doing streetwear and like the whole world right now, it's a massive movement that you could trace back to Grandmaster Flash, obviously. But when you see sneakers in Loro Piana, it's kind of like, whoa, okay, that's a major influence. And it's
shocking. Yeah. I'm like, what?
40, 50 years for that to happen, but it's a major influence. But you've sort of got to push back against it, and I think as an emerging designer, that's how you stand out, is by doing something that's sort of bucking the system and standing against the mainstream. Because if Tom Ford's doing sneakers, or if H&M is doing sneakers, it's hard to compete in both of those realms, whether it's mass or whether it's luxury and exclusive. And you come along and say, hey, what about my sneakers? It's hard to have that noise, to break through that noise. But if you're doing something fabulous that's the opposite of sneakers, then maybe people will go, wow, okay, here's someone.
Wait, what's going on over here?
Yeah.
I love it. Thank you so much. That really resonated with me. Just because I feel like none of us are really meant to be mainstream. Like we're all different. And so now, because sort of the norm is to, community is great, but we don't all have to be the same.
Yeah.
So when you dare to be different, you are being rebellious because you're daring to be yourself, Yeah. So if you have an opportunity to do that, it's always good.
And you were mentioning your experience of wanting to, maybe study fashion, and your what are you doing? So that I'm not saying in your case because I don't know, but in many cases, parents would look at fashion as a very insecure career.
Oh, absolutely. And they're very religious as well. So they were like, oh, Lord.
So, there's two reasons there why, they may be, and this is an experience that a lot of the kids have. I mean, I actually didn't have that. My parents were very supportive. They didn't necessarily, kind of understand St. Martin's and all that kind of thing. They did once I got there, but before attending, they didn't necessarily get it, but they let me go with it. But I think a lot of parents they want to support, they want their kids to be happy.
Of course.
So, there's a societal norm, let's say, and they want their kid to be able to flourish in that societal norm. That's just the natural thing with parents. So, I speak to parents all the time, and, you have to reassure that, the success is being happy in yourself. And you can have all the money in the world. You could be incredibly unhappy.
Yeah.
You can have nothing and be incredibly fulfilled because you're actually doing what that little voice inside of you is telling you should be doing in life. And it's very hard. I mean, I'm saying this. I mean,
it's so hard. So hard.
I definitely don't practice what I preach, but that is, I think, a universal truth that if you can follow that, then you'll find the peace within yourself. And fashion is the antithesis of that, actually, because it's always telling you that whatever you have now, you shouldn't be buying that thing. Because
right. But now we're like sustainability. Let's focus here, but we'll see how that goes. But, I have to ask, are you still in a band? Are you still?
Yeah, we have a new record out. Yeah, we just, so we actually, as I couldn't use the name Slinky Vagabond for fashion, but I've used it a couple of times for music. I had a band with David Bowie's guitar player, Earl Slick, and one of the Sex Pistols guys, and one of the.
You're so cool, Keanan. I can't with you. You're too cool for me.
So we did that. That was called Slinky Vagabond, and then we have a new record with a friend of mine who is based in Florence, Italy, and he has a studio there. And I was working there a lot for a couple of years in 2017, 2018. So we struck up a friendship, started writing together, and the record just came out in May. And we're getting a lot of nice notices here in the US, getting some nice press. And
what is it called, Keanan? What's the new band name? We need the info.
Well, the band name is Slinky Vagabond, and the album is called King Boy Vandals.
I love it.
Is an anagram of Slinky Vagabond. And, we kind of roped a bunch of friends into it to play on it. Some people that rock and roll people would know. A friend of mine who's in. Well, the one that you probably would know of is the band Guns N' Roses. So a friend of mine is on tour actually at the moment in Guns N' Roses. So he's playing guitar on a couple of tracks, and then got various musicians that have played with Bowie and with other bands in the 80s that I was acquainted with and friends with. So
what was the inspiration behind the album? Like, what can we expect?
Well, it's quite nostalgic actually. It's 10 songs. That many of them have a lyric that isn't about what you think it's about. For example, our first single was called "The Beauty in You,"
Oh, wow.
And so it's a ballad, and but the lyric is actually about all of those kind of abandoned towns around the world.
Wow.
So, I mean, it sounds a bit doom and gloom, but Chernobyl, the nuclear meltdown. So there's a town close to that that's completely abandoned, and nature's taken it over again. So it's all overgrown, and there are foxes and wild animals that are running around in that town because no one lives there anymore.
Yeah.
There are places like this all over the world that have been abandoned.
Wow.
So the lyric is, I see the beauty in you, I see the chaos too. And
I love it. Oh my goodness.
A lot of people might think it's a love song, and it kind of is, but it's a love song to, those abandoned ghost towns.
That's wild.
And
that is wild.
A lot of my lyrical content is like that. Like some of it is very, very what it is, but some of it is kind of takes a bit of poetic license. So the song isn't necessarily about what you think the subject matter would be. So
those are my favorites. I literally just maybe a day ago found out what Blackbird, what that song meant. Right. I had no idea. By the Beatles. I was like, what?
McCartney is the expert at those sort of hidden lyrical references.
I had no idea. So we're all like, yeah. And it's like, actually, it's wild. Well, this is a fashion moment, Keanan. So I mean, I could literally talk to you all day because I just want to hear every detail about your life. But what is your favorite fashion moment of all time? One of them. It could be something personal, professional, something that you've witnessed, it could be something from childhood, something that was just so magical. And I'm sure you have several, but if there's one that you could share with us that really stands out.
I think, so the teacher that I was talking to you about at St. Martin's, Natalie Gibson, we used to have, as part of St. Martin's, we had this one free trip where we went to another city or location, and the whole of our class went, and our class was small. It was like 12 students. So Natalie took us to Italy, and we went to a textile exhibit at Lake Como, which is pretty
Cute.
Fancy.
Yes.
Yeah. And so at this event, I met Claude Montana.
Wow.
Who is one of the most iconic designers, certainly in the 80s, along with Gautier and Terry Mugler, sort of the
trifecta.
The trifecta of sort of new design, I guess, in Paris. And this is, you have to remember, this is, all through St. Martin's, and I would still do this if I could get away with it, but all through St. Martin's, I used to wear full makeup. I had orange hair. I had platform shoes. I had very...
We need pictures, Keanan. I'm going to Google it.
You'll find some of them on the internet. I mean, I have a great picture somewhere of myself with a fashion editor, Hamish Bowles, and we
yes, stop it! I love it. And
I'm looking very gender fluid, let's say.
Yes,
but it was part of that. That was, androgyny is a big element of my design palette. I think it's very interesting, and it's very sort of culturally relevant today. But meeting Claude Montana, so I had a Diamante peaked visor with all my orange hair coming out.
Oh my God.
With a coat that looks like a dress. I mean, it's very like the era of Boy George and all of that, And Claude, I have a great picture where Claude's looking at me, giving me the sideways glance, what is this? So
I love it.
He was lovely. And we also met Mary Quant, who's one of the of British fashion.
Wow.
And that was all at this event, So again, kudos to my former teacher, who I'm still very close with, Natalie, for kind of taking us to something like that and introducing us to real icons of the industry, who sort of, and again, they demystified what fashion was, because they were pretty regular. I mean, Claude was a little bit strange, but they were pretty, Mary Quant was pretty regular person, so it was just really fabulous. And I do find, there's a magic in fashion. There's definitely magic. There are a lot of really magical people that you meet along the way. You've had some of them on your show, and that's to be treasured. It's, for all that we criticize fashion for, there are some really magical things that happen that don't happen in other areas of the arts. It's a unique collision of creativity and commerce that is very particular to what we do. So.
I love it. I love it. That's so beautiful. And I know I'm supposed to close right now, but one last question, Keanan.
Oh, fire away.
Your thoughts on the Met Gala, part 1. It's right around the corner, this September. What are your thoughts on the direction and the theme?
I mean, to be honest with you, I've never really been a fan of the Met Gala. I mean, I and that's just a personal thing. It's sort of changed in its nature as well. It's become very much a marketing exercise, as have the Oscars, the red carpet, the Oscars. So I think, I would like to see the Met Gala look at itself in the way that the greater fashion industry is also really trying to reassess what it is, what it stands for, what it should stand for. And, the Met Gala is the ultimate velvet rope. I mean, I know why it exists and I respect why it exists.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
But,
fundraiser. Yeah.
Again, as a sort of, as a sort of outsider, let's say, it's not something I've ever aspired to attend. I mean, there are some beautiful creations and there's some great expression there and so on. But I would, and maybe that's going to happen in these coming years. I would like to see it really addressed a lot of the sort of issues that we have in society today.
Me too. I'm like, I didn't really see it in the preview for part 1, but I'm hoping in what is it, May or February? I can't remember. For part 2, they'll address that. I'm hoping. I mean, it's,
and I hope, you saw a couple of years ago where suddenly every brand had a T-shirt that said "The future is female."
Yeah,
it was very heavy-handed, like kind of performative way of making that statement. I mean, it's great to make the statement, but making a few T-shirts in your line isn't really going to change anything.
Absolutely,
Great, do that, but also you need to make the harder decisions for a brand or for an entity too. And so I think, again, with sustainability, there's a lot of performative stuff going on in the industry where people are flying a flag, but, are they really in the long term going to execute that change? And it's, it is really questionable because a lot of big companies can't move that fast.
Yeah.
But, I would, that's all I would say on the Met Gala is I would love for it to truly try to be a change agent. And not just in a performative way, but in a very real way,
Agreed. Well, thank you so much, Keanan, for being on the show.
My pleasure. It's an honor. It's an
honor for me. Like I need another book from you, just like on your entire life, like from the beginning, like basically everything we talked about today, but like extended into like 150 or 200 pages. That's all.
I think fashion is really a great industry to be involved in, and it's a great place for expression. I've really enjoyed being part of it. I hope. I mean, I've kind of I kind of came and did what I wanted to do in a sense. Yeah. But I'm still very much involved in it, and I think for young designers today, they should feel optimistic about where the industry is today and the future of it too, because I think for all of the sort of negative things that we see that are real. There's a real opportunity for positive change too.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Keanan.
Pleasure.
Thank you. Thanks so much for joining me for this week of A Fashion Moment. If you like what you hear, we'd love for you to join our community of listeners and spread the word about the show. We also want to hear from you. Share your favorite fashion moments and dream guests with us by sending an audio clip or email to afashionmomentpodcast@gmail.com. Or you can tag us on Instagram @afashionmoment, and you could be featured on next week's episode. And don't forget to subscribe and leave us a review and let us know what you think. Until then, see you next time for another fashion moment. Podcast production by Rebecca Rashid and John Taylor Williams. Digital media production by Megan Porras.
This recording carries a Creative Commons 4.0 international license. Thanks to Patrick Patricios for their song, Hot Coffee.